So, you want to read Spider-Man? Spider-Man is arguably the world's most famous superhero. The web-swinging wall crawler has quipped his way into the zeitgeist for many years thanks to his relatability and the down-to-earth tone of most of his stories. Peter Parker, the Amazing Spider-Man, first appeared in Amazing Fantasy number 15 in 1962. After the huge success of that issue, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko went on to the Amazing Spider-Man comic book series. Now, you may have seen Spider-Man in the recent MCU movies, played the PS4 game, or maybe even the cartoon from the 90s.
Mary Jane, will you marry me?
This video is going to be a primer of sorts to get you into the world of Spider-Man and showcase some of his most famous stories, the different characters to wear the mantle, and some good starting points for new readers. So, let's see how it all started. Peter Parker, the Amazing Spider-Man. As already mentioned, Peter Parker, the Amazing Spider-Man, first appeared in Amazing Fantasy 15 in 1962 before getting his own solo series the following year in 1963. Spider-Man quickly became one of the biggest heroes in the Marvel comic line due to his youth and his humor. Back in the 60s, the only time younger people were shown as heroes in comics were his sidekicks. Notable examples of this are Robin, Dick Grayson, Bucky, who was Captain America's boy sidekick, and Spidey, who was Green Arrow's sidekick for some time. Kids were the main demographic of comics back then, so all these sidekicks were a huge hit with the general audience. Spider-Man, however, flipped that idea on its head. Peter Parker became Spider-Man at the young age of 15 years old.
Every day with these damn alarms.
Don't make me come down there, you punk.
This let Peter Parker become the most relatable hero to the key audience of comic book readers because he was dealing with most of the same issues that his readers were dealing with. Worrying about girls, homework, and bullies is something that most audience members can relate to in one way or another. Jokingly called Puny Parker during the day, Peter Parker became the Amazing Spider-Man by night after being bitten by a radioactive spider. Peter Parker was, for all intents and purposes, a nerd. He was awkward and really only was appreciated by his aunt, uncle, and some of his miscellaneous teachers. After the usual teasing and humiliation from Flash Thompson and his group at school one day, Peter heads to a science exhibit about radioactivity. While the presentation is going, Peter is bitten by a spider infected with the radioactivity. After fleeing the exhibit, he discovers that he has the proportionate strength and speed of a spider, as well as the ability to stick to walls. That night, he hears about a wrestling match that anyone can enter. If you could last 3 minutes in the ring with Crusher Hogan, you'd get $100. Fearing ridicule if he failed, Peter made a disguise and headed back to the ring. He trounced Crusher Hogan with little issue. After that, he was approached by a promoter saying that he could make Peter rich. For the first time in his life, Peter Parker felt like he was on top of the world, and his ego started to match that feeling. After his performance, a burglar steals from the promoter in the building where Peter is in, but as a cop asks for help stopping the criminal, Peter lets him go. Fast forward a few hours and Peter is told that his Uncle Ben startled a burglar and was shot and killed. In a rage, Peter tracks down the killer in his Spider-Man outfit and finds that the person who shot Uncle Ben is the same burglar he let run past him after his show just hours earlier. After defeating the criminal and leaving him webbed up for cops, Peter vows that with great power must also come great responsibility. This is Spider-Man's origin story. I'm sure everybody watching at least has a passing familiarity with it. Fun fact, in some versions of the character, Oscorp makes the spider, and in current canon, it's basically confirmed that the spider bit Peter because of his destiny as a spider totem. Comics are fun. So after Peter's origin, he has many ups and downs. Some notable characters are bully turned friend Flash Thompson, his great friend and ex-girlfriend Betty Brant, his first real love Gwen Stacy, and of course we can't forget about Peter's longest running love interest Mary Jane Watson. Part of what makes Peter Parker and the Spider-Man moniker as a whole interesting is because our hero will always have to balance his personal life with his superhero life. This can include normal friend group drama, missing dates, birthday parties, etc., or it can mean he publicly misses his friends in the hospital, or he can't pay his bills because his double life doesn't allow him to have a quote-unquote normal job. In classic Spider-Man stories, Peter is a relatively grounded hero. He's what is commonly referred to as a street-level hero. This means he takes down burglars and other enemies, mostly located in New York City. In the 90s, things got weird with stories like the Clone Saga and the whole Spider Totem thing, like I mentioned, but the 90s as a whole were an extremely weird time for comics. So I kind of consider those stories as a product of their time more than anything. Until the early 2000s, Peter Parker was one of the few characters that actually had some significant character growth. Him and Mary Jane were going steady and were actually married for quite a long time. Many readers loved this and actually wanted Peter to become a family man, but Joe Quesada had other ideas. Joe Quesada is the former editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. I actually have no real gripes with the man besides his gross mishandling of Spider-Man during his time. If you've heard of any Spider-Man stories, you've undoubtedly heard of One More Day. This 2007 storyline is set in post-Civil War Marvel Comics, one of my favorite comic book eras, largely because I started taking an interest in comics around this time. One More Day had Aunt May essentially on her deathbed after an assassin meant for Peter missed his shot. Now, the assassin missing his shot because Peter dodged it because of his spider sense, and then that proceeded to hit Aunt May, that's an interesting concept, you know, because she's on his deathbed and Peter is forced to make some really hard decisions. For example, again, this is post-Civil War, so Peter needs to go back to Tony Stark and beg him to get Aunt May the best care possible. And eventually, Tony comes around, but at first, he pretty much tells Peter to kick rocks because of their strained relationship after the events of Civil War. And all this happens while Peter is trying to conceal his identity that is now out in the public, but he's trying to keep Mary Jane and Aunt May safe, and he ultimately failed to do so. So you see some really great character growth here, and they have this thing called the Back in Black arc, which is actually great. Peter pulls out the cloth version of the symbiote suit. It's pretty much just a black Spider-Man suit, and he smacks the hell out of Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, who put this hit out on Peter in the first place. And he essentially says, if my aunt dies, you're going to die. All right. And this was like a really dark turn for the character. It was kind of awesome because we were seeing some real character growth, and we really didn't know at the time if Peter was actually going to kill somebody because of this. And on top of J. Michael Straczynski's writing just kind of being great all around like it has been since the 90s, this was actually a great storyline. But then editorial wanted to do One More Day. And oh man, this is one of the most infamous comics of all time. This storyline most famously concludes with Mary Jane and Peter sacrificing their marriage and unborn child to the devil, Mephisto. This reset about 20 years of character growth for Peter. Needless to say, people don't like this story, because after this happens, Peter Parker's identity is once again hidden from the world, and he's essentially mooching off of his now-alive aunt. Peter turns into a bum at the end of the story, but the silver lining is that the following story, Brand New Day, is actually a pretty good starting point for readers, as it's essentially a soft reboot to the character. In the 2010s, we had a story called The Superior Spider-Man, which has its flaws but is generally well received, and I personally reread it every couple of years. This was a big change because Doc Ock took over Peter's mind as his body was dying. As Doc Ock sees Peter's memories, he finally understands why Peter does what he does, and he vows to be the Superior Spider-Man. During this time, Otto Pete creates Parker Industries and also makes millions in the process. Obviously, the story ends with Peter getting his life back, but the fallout caused many of his recent stories to focus on Parker Industries, and it lost the quote-unquote everyman side of Peter until 2018, when Nick Spencer took over ASM. There's plenty of actually great Spider-Man stories to talk about later, but first I want to talk about the second most popular Spider-Man. Miles Morales, the Ultimate Spider-Man. God, this character has done nothing but get better since he was introduced. While I may not care for his current run's dollar store Clone Saga ripoff, the tender moments of Miles being Spider-Man and helping normal civilians is really a breath of fresh air. Anyway, Miles Morales is a character that is originally from the Ultimate Universe. The Ultimate Universe was Marvel's way of bringing their comics to a more modern setting. Ultimate Spider-Man was the first of these Ultimate books set on Earth 1610 instead of our usual Earth 616. In this comic, Peter Parker was actually the main Spider-Man from 2001 to 2011. This universe's Peter Parker died after a standoff with the Sinister Six, and this inspired Miles Morales to take up the mantle once he got spider powers from another Oscorp spider. His initial introduction was met with mixed opinions, to say the least. Just try and look up the fan letters in the back of the first few Miles Morales issues. It is rough. It's obvious that a large part of this controversy was because Miles isn't white, which will be an albeit stupid turnoff for some people regarding the character. The original story of Miles took a pretty dark tone and wound up with Miles' uncle, Aaron, dying. However, in the current canon, after Secret Wars 2015, all of Miles' family is alive and well as far as I can remember. Nowadays, Miles Morales' comics take a pretty serious tone with really touching moments of brevity. My personal favorite is when Miles sees a kid crying because they were getting bullied and manages to cheer them up by taking them around the city to go swinging. This kid shows up again and creates Miles' current costume for him. As a character, Miles has only been around for maybe a decade, but he's shaping up to be a staple of the Marvel superhero lineup. He's teamed up with the Avengers, founded the Champions team, and my personal favorite, Peter Parker himself, now that they are in the same universe. I can safely recommend starting at any of Miles' number ones, but the two best interpretations of the character for me come down to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and the PlayStation game Spider-Man Miles Morales. Both of these tell origin stories of sorts for the characters and give you two different but equally fleshed out versions of Miles for you to sink your teeth into. Jumping off points. Alright, so comics can be very confusing to get into due to the nature of relaunches, volumes, reboots, and all that. I'm probably going to be making a video about that sometime. However, I'm going to give you guys some spots where you can just pick up an issue and get into Spider-Man. First up, we have Amazing Spider-Man number 1. The Amazing Spider-Man title is the flagship Spider-Man title that features most of the biggest known Spider-Man storylines. If you don't mind the somewhat cheesy and dated dialogue, just starting at number 1 is a pretty good spot to get into the character. Reading up until issue 100 or so should give you plenty of Spider-Man stories. If you're really enjoying yourself, you can just keep reading from 1 to 800, but I know most people don't have the time or dedication to do that. If you just read straight through, you may run into some gaps in the story because of events happening in the sister title, The Spectacular Spider-Man, as well as other crossover events like Secret Wars and Civil War. Next up, we have Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man by Chip Zdarsky. It's just awesome. This series really captures the heart of Spider-Man for me, and there's definitely a fair share of unnecessary sci-fi stuff that modern Spider-Man is known for, but this really shows the human side of Peter Parker's character. To top it off, this is the first time since 2007 we actually got some character growth. As a side note, my personal favorite issue of Spider-Man ever is issue number 6 from this run, and it's called My Dinner with Jonah. I can't recommend this run enough. Now we have Ultimate Spider-Man number 1. This comic launched the whole Ultimate universe, and this book is generally beloved. Brian Michael Bendis was in charge of writing for the series, so you can expect a lot of his trademark dialogue. Once you read The Death of Spider-Man, I'd recommend you just keep reading through Ultimate Comics Spider-Man until you get Miles' origin and his first couple of adventures. If you enjoy the more youthful interpretations of Spider-Man, seen in the likes of the MCU or the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon, this will be for you. Alright, before we move on to recommended stories, I have a couple non-comic jumping off points for Spider-Man. First up, we have Spider-Man for the PS4 and PS5. This game is incredible. Seriously, it's been a top 3 game for me ever since I played it. It drops you into the world of a 23-year-old Peter Parker who's been doing the Spider-Man thing for 8 years now. He has an extensive rogue gallery filled with villains, but leaves a lot of his other big villains for future installments, such as Venom, Kraven, and I'm sure Green Goblin is going to show up eventually as well. Attached to this is also Spider-Man Miles Morales, as previously mentioned. The gameplay is much more involved thanks to the stealth components and Venom Blast powers that Miles has. This is honestly my favorite iteration of Spider-Man, even more so than the comics. Some of the movies are all good starting points as well. I'm primarily referring to Into the Spider-Verse, which I've already talked about. This movie goes into the anybody can wear the mask narrative that's been coming up a lot more in these recent stories, and the movie is just incredible. It's a 10 out of 10, easy. I would also say that all 3 of the live-action Spider-Man origin movies do a pretty good job as well. Spider-Man 1 captures the heart of Peter Parker, and Willem Dafoe obviously brings it like he always does, despite Maguire's porn-level acting talent. The Amazing Spider-Man has my favorite first hour out of all of these. It feels like it was ripped out of the Ultimate Spider-Man, and I really like the potential that the series had. Last but not least, we have Spider-Man Homecoming. It's pretty great. I don't really care for the MCU Spider-Man for a variety of reasons, but this felt like a really good high school Spider-Man story about responsibility. Much like Willem Dafoe playing Green Goblin, Michael Keaton absolutely kills it in his role as the Vulture here. On to the recommended reading. Man, the character of Spider-Man has had a lot of ups and downs. But here's some of my favorite stories that keep me coming back for more. I would like to note that these stories can be your first Spider-Man stories, but I personally only recommend them if you're already familiar with the mythos. First up, we got Spider-Man Life Story by Chip Zdarsky. This is a modern classic, in my opinion. This tells the story of Spider-Man Peter Parker if he aged in real time. Each of these 6 issues covers a decade of Peter's life as he goes from a young Spider-Man to being a mentor for his children and Miles Morales. This story is super great, and if you like this, Chip Zdarsky also just finished Fantastic Four Life Story, which is the same premise but for the Fantastic Four. Highly recommend both of these. It's incredible. I can't say too much without giving away the plot, but read it. Next is Spider-Man Blue. This retells the story of Gwen Stacy's death and the tremendous amount of guilt that follows Peter because of it. This is probably the most emotional of the Spider-Man stories I've talked about in this video, and I can't really say much about the comic other than the fact that it's a great down-to-earth Spider-Man one-shot. Check it out if you want to dive deeper into the psyche of Peter Parker. Spider-Man Kraven's Last Hunt is a very famous story thanks to this famous comic book cover. As you could probably tell, this is one of the darker Spider-Man stories. I mean, it literally features him being buried alive an inch from death. It's pretty insane, and it was a pretty big deviation from the lighthearted stories that we started with. This is a definitive Spider-Man story that takes place right after the Alien Suit saga. The ending to the story is also incredibly well known, but in case you don't know, I'm not going to spoil it, but if you want darker tones in your Spider-Man and you like having a more adult version of Peter Parker, this is it. Alright everybody, well, thank you for watching. This is the first in a series of videos I have planned called So You Wanna Read. As I got into comics, I really wish I knew where to start. As a kid, I would pick up a single issue from the grocery store sometimes, and it would be smack dab in the middle of the story. I just had no idea where to start thanks to legacy issue numbers, volumes, and all that other complicated stuff. I really want this series to be a one-stop shop for new comic readers now that I've learned about the industry and have read a ton of comics over the past decade or so. So please, if you have any requests for a specific character, let me know in the comments. I already have some videos planned for comics like Invincible, Saga, Moon Knight, and more. Well everybody, I have been Jared, you've been wonderful, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.